This man, Samuel Dorsey, was waiting for execution that night. But his last wish was not a meal, not a cigarette, not even a call home. His last wish was to hold a rosary. After that moment, something happened that no one in the prison could explain. The lights flickered, cameras froze, and every guard felt a sudden presence in the air. And what followed was a miracle, one that stopped the execution, revealed the truth, and saved the life of Samuel Dorsey, the man the world had already condemned. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We want to see how far stories of faith like this can reach. And if you believe the world still needs to hear stories like Samuel's, subscribe now and help us keep them alive. Let us start. The night air outside Greystone Correctional Facility carried the kind of stillness that presses against the soul. The last trace of daylight had long vanished beyond the razor-wire fences, leaving only a pale spill of moonlight across the concrete yard and the faint hum of sodium lamps that made every surface look colder than it was. Inside the east wing, behind two electronically sealed doors and a line of steel bars, sat Samuel Dorsey, inmate number 347892. He was 43 years old, once a small-town mechanic in Jefferson County, known for fixing old Chevrolets and never charging widows or veterans. In another life, before the headlines and the cuffs, people called him Sam the Honest. But honesty had not saved him the night a co-worker named Russell Keene was found beaten to death behind the auto shop they both worked at. The police had found Samuel's wrench near the body, his fingerprints smeared on the handle, and blood that in the first rushed lab test was said to be Keene's. It was enough for the prosecutor, enough for a jury, and far too much for a man whose only lawyer was a public defender with a stack of cases higher than the courthouse steps. Now, 7 years later, Samuel sat in cell 23B, awaiting execution by lethal injection. He had not seen the outside world since 2009. His wife had stopped visiting after the second appeal was denied, and his mother had passed 2 winters earlier, clutching the same rosary he now kept in his pocket. He had always been a quiet believer, the kind of man who didn't preach, just prayed. But faith, for him, had turned from comfort to survival. At 8 p.m., a correctional officer slid a meal tray through the slot: mashed potatoes, green beans, a square of cornbread. Samuel touched nothing. The chaplain, Father Gabriel Price, arrived an hour later, carrying a small leather-bound Bible and a silver cross that glinted faintly under the fluorescent light. He was a weary man in his 60s, his voice low and practiced, his eyes kind, but trained not to hope. He had seen too many men die on this corridor, some weeping, some shouting, most silent. "Samuel," he said softly through the bars, "the warden wants to know if you'd like to make a final statement or confession." Samuel lifted his head. His beard was gray at the chin, his hands rough and trembling. "Father," he answered, "I've told the truth from the start. I didn't kill that man, but I forgive whoever did." He paused, then added, "I have one request." Father Price nodded. "Anything within reason. May I have a rosary? Just to hold. I lost mine when they transferred me here." The chaplain hesitated only a moment, then reached into his coat. "It's not new," he said, passing the small bundle through the bars. "The beads are wood, but it's seen many prayers." Samuel smiled faintly. "That's the best kind." He pressed the rosary to his lips and closed his eyes. For several minutes he said nothing, just breathed, slow, deliberate, as if listening for something distant. The hum of the lights, the metallic groan of doors, the rhythmic drip from a leaking pipe, all merged into a kind of quiet heartbeat. By 10 p.m., the other inmates had fallen silent too. Even the ones known for shouting at night stayed still. It was as if the whole block sensed something was unfolding. Through the narrow window, the moonlight formed a pale cross on the floor beside Samuel's cot. He sat beneath it whispering, "Hail Mary, full of grace," over and over until the words blended into a rhythm older than the prison itself. At 11:47 p.m., the lights flickered once, then again. A guard named Thomas Reeves, a veteran correctional officer who had seen everything from riots to suicides, looked up from his desk. "Power surge," he muttered, checking the circuit panel. Everything was normal, except for the hallway cameras. One by one, their screens froze on the same frame. Samuel in prayer, head bowed, rosary shining faintly in his hands. In the control room, another officer leaned forward. "Why's it frozen like that?" he asked. Reeves frowned, tapping the monitor. The image didn't move, but on the speaker line, open for cell surveillance, came a whisper, faint yet clear. "He is not alone." "Did you hear that?" the younger officer asked. Reeves swallowed hard. Sounded like two voices. Back in cell 23B, Samuel felt the air change. It grew warmer, not with heat, but with presence. The way a room feels when someone walks in quietly behind you. He didn't open his eyes. He only tightened his grip on the beads and said, "Lord, if I must go, then let me go clean." The rosary glowed faintly in the dim light. Midnight struck. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed. A distant ambulance maybe, or something else. The sound echoed through the corridors, faded, and left only silence. Even the guards in the watchtower stopped talking. Then came the moment that would later fill every rumor, every inmate's retelling. The shadow on the wall that didn't belong to Samuel. The light in his cell, weak and yellow a moment before, turned silver white. For a heartbeat, the security camera blinked back to life and captured a frame that no technician could later explain. Two silhouettes standing side by side, one kneeling, one upright, the taller figure's hand resting on the other's shoulder. When the lights returned to normal, Samuel looked up at the small barred window, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not alone anymore." And though every man in that block swore they had heard him say it, no one could agree on what they felt in that instant, only that the entire prison seemed to exhale at once, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath. That night, a story began that Missouri would talk about for years, a story that began with a prayer, a rosary, and a man who never stopped believing that even in the darkest cell, heaven could still find a way in. The corridor outside Samuel's cell stayed silent long after midnight. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed quieter, as though the whole building had slipped into some uneasy pause between night and dawn. The guards didn't speak, and neither did Samuel. He sat with his back against the wall, the rosary wound tightly through his fingers, his lips still moving in half-formed prayers. Through the narrow slot in the door, Officer Reeves glanced in again. "Dorsey," he called softly, "you all right?" Samuel turned his head slightly. His face looked strangely peaceful. The deep lines of exhaustion softened somehow. "I'm all right," he answered, voice calm. "You don't have to worry. Something's coming, but it's not what you think." Reeves frowned, uneasy. He'd heard dying men talk about angels, ghosts, voices, but there was something different in Samuel's tone. Not fear, not delirium, just certainty. He closed the slot and stepped back. "Keep an eye on him," he told the younger guard, "but don't open that door unless I say so." Inside, Samuel bowed his head again. He whispered the final words of the rosary's sorrowful mysteries, his voice barely audible. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." Then silence, absolute heavy silence. A breath of warm air moved through the cell. The temperature had been dropping all night, yet suddenly it felt like spring. The light bulb overhead flickered twice, then steadied, glowing brighter than before. And then from that brightness, a figure began to form, not in a burst or flash, but gently, as if revealed by the air itself. Samuel blinked hard. The figure stood only a few feet away, a man in simple white garments, barefoot, his hands visible, calloused, marked by wounds that no earthly healing could erase. His face was calm, not glowing or distant, but alive with a sorrow that carried infinite peace. Samuel slid from the cot to his knees, his breath caught in his throat. "Lord," he whispered, "is it you?" The figure looked at him, not above him, not through him, but at him, like someone seeing a friend after a long absence. "Do not be afraid," the voice said. "You have carried the cross of another man." Samuel's tears fell freely. "I prayed you would forgive them," he said, his words shaking. "I know," said Jesus, "and because of that, mercy has found you." The walls of the cell seemed to vanish for a moment. The sound of dripping water faded, replaced by something softer, like distant music, faint and unearthly, yet comforting. Samuel felt the ground beneath him, the cold stone floor, but also something else, a weight lifting from his chest, a pressure easing from his heart. He had lived in despair for so long that peace felt almost unbearable. Jesus knelt beside him, his voice lowered, nearly a whisper. "They took your freedom, but not your faith. What you believed in silence will soon be shouted in light." Samuel looked up through tears. "Lord, why me?" "Because you prayed for mercy, not vengeance," Jesus replied, "and mercy opens doors that justice alone cannot." The light grew brighter for an instant. Then the figure stood, placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, and said, "Forgive them, even those who have taken your years. You will see what faith can do." And then, as quietly as it had begun, the presence faded. The light softened back to its ordinary pale yellow. The air cooled. The dripping pipe resumed. Samuel remained kneeling for a long time, shaking, whispering thank yous through tears. He kissed the rosary once more and placed it against his heart. "Whatever happens next," he murmured, "your will be done." Outside the cell, the control room monitors began to flicker back to life. The younger guard gasped. "What the? Look at that!" Reeves turned, eyes wide. On the screen, the last frozen frame had changed. Samuel was still kneeling, but a faint second outline stood beside him, hand extended. It lasted only seconds before vanishing completely. At 3:12 a.m., the intercom crackled. "We need Warden Hensley on the line, urgent." Reeves grabbed the phone. "What's wrong?" "There's a call from Jefferson County," came the voice from the front desk. "Sheriff's office says they found something about the Dorsey case." Minutes later, the warden himself arrived, pulling a coat over his shoulders, face pale. He held a manila folder in one hand. "They found a letter," he said quietly. A confession. From a drifter in Arkansas. He described the murder, every detail, even things we never released to the press. Reeves stared at him. You mean? Yes, the warden said, exhaling sharply. It wasn't Dorsey. The man who did it wrote everything before he died last month. The county just received his storage box from an estate sale. There's no question. Dorsey's innocent. The younger guard looked stunned. Then the execution? Cancelled, the warden said, effective immediately. They rushed down the corridor. When they opened Samuel's door, he was sitting on the cot, eyes closed, the rosary still in his hands. Dorsey, the warden said, breathless, you're not going anywhere tonight. There's been a discovery. Samuel opened his eyes slowly. I know, he said quietly. What do you mean, you know? He smiled faintly, tired but calm. Because God told me he would make it right. The warden looked at Father Price, who had just arrived and stood frozen at the threshold, the faint smell of incense meeting him before any words did. Later, he would tell a reporter that he hadn't brought incense that night, and yet the entire cell block smelled like a church at Easter Mass. By sunrise, word had spread through the prison. Inmates who'd mocked Samuel now pressed their palms to their bars, whispering prayers of their own. Guards who had rolled their eyes at his faith lowered their heads when he passed. The governor's office called for a full review. DNA analysis confirmed what Samuel had said for years. The wrench had been touched after the crime, by the real killer, not by him. Every file, every witness statement began to unravel, like a knot finally pulled free after years of strain. In the chapel that morning, Samuel knelt alone before the crucifix. He didn't ask for explanations or vengeance. He only whispered, Thank you, Lord. I was ready to die, but you gave me something better than life. You gave me truth. Outside, the first light of morning touched the razor wire, and for a moment it shone like threads of gold. The news spread faster than the warden could control it. Within 24 hours of the halted execution, word of the Missouri miracle reached every local paper and evening broadcast. Some treated it as a legal story, wrongful conviction overturned in dramatic last-minute discovery, while others leaned toward the unexplainable. Inmate's prayer halts execution at midnight. Coincidence or divine hand? Inside Greystone Correctional Facility, no one needed headlines. They had felt it. Every man and woman who worked that night, from guards to janitors, spoke of the same impossible calm, the same golden light that had touched the corridor and vanished with the dawn. It became one of those stories that lived quietly in memory but refused to fade, whispered in corners, repeated in half-truths. But for Samuel Dorsey, freedom didn't come with the sunrise. The state had suspended his sentence, not erased it. He was moved off death row to Block F, a quieter section reserved for protective custody. His cell there was small and bare, but it had a window, the first real one he'd seen in 7 years. Through it, he could see a patch of sky, sometimes a bird. He never complained again. The legal process was slow, too slow. The court-appointed attorneys now working his case promised hearings and reviews, but months stretched into years. The system that had rushed to condemn him now crawled to release him. Yet Samuel never once raised his voice. He woke at dawn every morning and prayed, not for justice. He'd already seen that justice was only the shadow of something greater, but for patience. He prayed for the men still waiting for their appeals, for the officers who looked at him differently now, for the families of those who had hated him. He prayed most of all for the soul of the man who had confessed in that letter, a drifter who had died alone in a cheap motel, name unknown until the papers found it scrawled in pencil. It was during those months in Block F that the prison itself began to change. The chaplain, Father Price, noticed it first. Guards who had once joked about Dorsey's invisible friend began leaving folded notes outside his cell, prayers for sick children, broken marriages, lost sons. Inmates from other blocks requested transfers just to attend Mass with him. Some nights, a guard would unlock the chapel early and find Samuel already there, kneeling before the crucifix in the dim light, whispering rosaries for men who hadn't spoken to him in years. He prays, Father Price told the warden one afternoon, and the air changes. You feel it, even if you don't believe. The warden didn't argue. He'd been in the control room the night the monitors froze. He'd smelled that incense. Some things didn't need convincing. 2 Christmases passed. Then one spring morning, April 4th, 2018, Samuel was called to the administrative wing. The air outside was cool, and the dogwoods were blooming along the fence. He walked down the hallway slowly, rosary in hand, escorted by a single guard who no longer felt like an enemy. When he entered the small office, a man in a dark suit stood waiting. "Mr. Dorsey," the man said, "the court has reached a decision." The words came simply, "Conviction vacated. Case dismissed. You are a free man." Samuel didn't speak. He just looked out the narrow window toward the yard, where sunlight touched the barbed wire and turned it gold again. Father Price placed a hand on his shoulder. "You prayed your way out of hell," he said softly. "No," Samuel answered, smiling through tears. "He carried me out." The release process took hours. Fingerprint verifications, signatures, property returns. His old clothes no longer fit, so the warden gave him a gray jacket from Lost and Found. When the gate finally opened, Samuel stepped outside and felt wind on his face for the first time in nearly a decade. He stood there a long time, letting it move through his hair, his beard, the lines around his eyes. There was no crowd, no camera waiting yet, only a quiet parking lot and an old pickup that Father Price had borrowed. Samuel climbed in, holding his rosary like it was the only real thing in the world. The next morning, the story exploded again. Innocent man freed after divine intervention. Read the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Reporters camped outside his sister's home in Jefferson County. Churches called to invite him to speak. Legal advocates praised his patience. Theologians debated his vision. But Samuel stayed silent. He declined interviews. When a reporter finally reached him on the phone and asked what he planned to do after everything he'd lost, he simply said, "Go home, fix what I can. Thank God I never stopped believing." He found work in a friend's garage, quiet jobs fixing tractors and old Fords. He went to Mass every morning and spent afternoons writing letters to men still behind bars, telling them not to give up, not to let anger rot their souls. And yet, even in freedom, there were nights when Samuel woke in a cold sweat, hearing the clank of metal doors, the footsteps in the corridor. Trauma doesn't vanish with justice, but when that fear rose, he reached for the same worn rosary and whispered, "I'm not alone anymore." The townspeople called him the man God saved from death row. Samuel hated the title. "He didn't save me from death," he would say gently. "He saved me from bitterness." In time, the governor's office arranged a formal ceremony to deliver his compensation, $1 million for wrongful conviction and years lost. The crowd applauded as he signed the papers, but Samuel's expression didn't change. When a reporter asked if it felt like victory, he said quietly, "No, it feels like mercy." That evening, he went to the small stone church where his mother had once prayed every day before her death. He sat in the back pew, just as she used to, and laid the checkbook beside the candle rack. 7 years took a lot, he whispered, looking at the crucifix, but faith gave more back. And as he left the church, the last sunlight of the day caught the stained glass of the Virgin Mary, soft blue and gold, and scattered it across the aisle like shards of heaven. Autumn arrived gently in Jefferson County, the air rich with the scent of leaves and distant bonfires. The storms of the past, the courtroom, the prison, the long silence of injustice had settled behind Samuel Dorsey like a mountain he had finally crossed. He was 46 now, lean from work, eyes clear again, a man rebuilt from quiet faith and steady labor. He still lived simply, a modest house near the edge of town, a small workshop behind it, a gravel driveway with an old Ford pickup that coughed but never failed him. Each morning before sunrise, Samuel would sit by the window with a cup of coffee and his rosary. He no longer prayed for miracles. He prayed for usefulness, to be of some small good while he was still here. That prayer was answered in a way he didn't expect. One afternoon, as he sat in St. Mary's Parish Hall after Sunday service, he overheard 2 teenagers arguing. The church's youth center had fallen apart. Paint peeling, roof leaking, no funds left. Father Price sighed, saying it might have to close by winter. Samuel listened quietly. He had recently received his compensation, $1 million the state called it, for the years unjustly taken. He called it something else, the most dangerous test God ever gave me. That evening, sitting alone at his kitchen table, Samuel opened the envelope again. The number on the check still looked wrong. Too much for one man, especially one who had done nothing to earn it, but survive. He ran his thumb over the paper, thinking about the men still behind bars, the children growing up without faith, and the faces of the gods who had come to him for prayers when no one else would listen. He took a deep breath and smiled faintly. "All right, Lord," he whispered. "If you gave me this, you already know where it's going." 2 weeks later, Father Price called him in shock. "Samuel, this check," he stammered, holding the document with trembling hands. $500,000, made out to St. Mary's Church, in the memo line, for forgiveness before it's needed. The donation rebuilt the entire youth wing, new walls, fresh paint, a roof that no longer leaked. The community helped renovate it with their own hands. A contractor donated materials, a carpenter offered his time, and local volunteers painted the walls a warm golden color that caught the light beautifully at dusk. When it reopened, the parish named it the House of Second Chances, not because Samuel asked for it, but because no other name fit. In the center of the new hall, they placed a small glass display with Samuel's old wooden rosary, the same one he had held on the night of his near execution. Beneath it, an engraved plaque read, "Faith doesn't always open the prison door. Sometimes it opens heaven's instead." The story reached beyond Jefferson County. Local news came first, then national outlets, but Samuel avoided the cameras. "The miracle isn't me," he told one journalist who found him outside the church, sleeves rolled up, sweeping the front steps. "It's what faith did after me." When asked why he gave so much away, he answered, "Because I saw mercy, and once you've seen mercy, you can't keep it to yourself." From then on, Samuel became a quiet presence in the community. Not a hero, not a preacher, just a man who fixed cars, listened to people, and prayed when they couldn't. When someone asked how he stayed so calm after everything, he smiled and said, "Because forgiveness is freedom, and I've had enough prison for one lifetime." Years passed, and the youth center flourished. Every evening, you could hear laughter, guitar music, the shuffle of sneakers on the old gym floor. The children who once wandered the streets now learned to build, to read, to pray. Some even carried rosaries of their own, small replicas sold to fund the center. And each day, before locking up, Father Price would stop by the display case. When the last sunlight came through the west window, it struck those old wooden beads perfectly, making them glimmer as if alive. He never called it a miracle out loud. He simply nodded and whispered, "He's still here." Samuel often stood there too. Just before evening mass, he'd look at that rosary and remember the night he thought his story had ended. But it hadn't. It had only begun. "God didn't save me from death," he once told Father Price. "He saved me for life, to show what faith can still do." And maybe that's why this story still matters, because faith doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, silent as a man praying behind bars, until the world finally grows quiet enough to listen. If this story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who's struggling to believe again. Let them hear about Samuel, about the power of mercy, the proof of forgiveness, the miracle that came not through lightning or thunder, but through a man who simply refused to stop trusting God. Tell us in the comments what you think mercy looks like in your own life. And if you want to hear more true stories like this, subscribe and stay with us. These stories aren't made to entertain. They're made to remind us what's still possible. Because somewhere tonight, in a small town in Missouri, when the sun sets and the bells of St. Mary's begin to ring, a single beam of light still finds that old rosary, shining quietly, as if heaven hasn't forgotten the man who prayed beneath its gaze. God bless you. Thank you for watching. May faith always guide your heart, even when the world feels uncertain.